Today we're going to talk about Phoenix transactions, as you said. But before we jump into that, is there any insolvency industry news that's interesting?
Not that's interesting. I think we're very lucky that we're going through a phase in insolvency where not much is changing at the moment, which was pre-COVID was pretty normal, and you didn't even bother having a update section. No. But certainly in the current environment, it's been busy. But lately, it's apart from understanding how governments in the state governments are going to deal with these various lockdowns, insolvency-wise, there's pretty much nothing to offer at all at the moment, so which is a nice change.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's good. Probably no news is good news, Ash.
No, we like no news.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about phoenixing, and hopefully we can clear up some of the misconceptions about the whole topic. Yeah. Because I think phoenixing is often spoken about, but is pretty rarely understood and what it all means. So where does the term phoenixing even come from, Ash?
Well, I mean, everyone has heard of the mythical phoenix, bird, and then if you're a Harry Potter fan, we've seen the bird in action in Harry Potter and in the movies. But really, it obviously started from the idea that some of these businesses would just fall over and start up again in a new entity and just keep trading on. So that's sort of the background of it. And it's talking about the movement of assets to another entity and defeating creditors is where it's all started from.
So the new business rises out of the ashes of the old.
That's it.
Can you give us a bit of a background to phoenixing in the business world rather than the Harry Potter world?
It's more fun in the Harry Potter world, Phil.
I doubt that, mate.
In the business world, really, I mean, Phoenix has been talked about for as long as I've ever watched any business reports. So there's people talk about it and bring it up all the time. But in reality, in terms of it being effective in the Corporations Act and in the law, up until a couple of years ago, there was no mention of it at all. It's up until, and we'll talk about the legislation a bit later, but up until about 18 months ago, it wasn't in any legislation at all. There's no definition of it. People, talked about ideas and even people talked about the concept of what it was, but they could only give it by an example. They couldn't actually give it a definition. And it wasn't really until in the business world, it didn't really get brought up by the regulators. ASIC and ATO brought it up not until about October 2017.
Right. So it's spoken about a lot, but not even defined. What did ASIC say about it in October? ASIC and the ATO say about it in October 2017.
Yeah, well, they did a joint release back then and tried to put some robustness around what it actually meant. And it was a large document that had lots of examples and still didn't really have a definition. But what they were able to do was that they created what they call the sliding scale of Phoenix to try and put things in context. And what they did in the scale is that they created 3 levels. There was a commercial necessity, problematic, and illegal. So that document pretty much said certain, commercial necessity, legal, illegal was illegal.
So let's start with commercial necessity, Phoenix.
Yep.
What's that? What's that mean?
So before I get into the detail, there's one thing I do want to say up front is that in Jonge Read, we're known for doing pre-packs and assisting with these type of Phoenix transactions. But the commercial necessity is the only type that we will work with directors on. And that's because it's the only legal form. So, and a commercial necessity effectively was designed, or what ASIC and ATO said was that if a business owner can use the corporate form to do a business restructure for commercial necessity reasons, and generally that's because it's from an event that wasn't at the fault of the director.
Right.
So, in our current environment, COVID is a classic example of this, where we're seeing businesses that have been adversely affected by COVID-19, and therefore their business is in trouble, so they can use that there. You've also got, it could be as simple as that another debtor, one of their debtors goes down, or they lose a big contract. There's a number of different reasons why a business could get into trouble, not purely at the fault of the director. So, and ASIC and the ATO in this document talked heavily about that when those circumstances occur, the use of this corporate form and the Phoenix transaction is completely legitimate and often a viable way of keeping a business alive.
Well, that makes me feel pretty good, given I'm the compliance manager. we're only doing legal ones. So we're talking about a single Phoenix event that sometimes arises because something's gone wrong. There's been an event outside the control of the business owner. Is that right, Ash?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. So even though it's a commercial necessity Phoenix, actually, it's still a bad thing though, right? It's still bad for the economy and it's still bad for society.
No, not at all. No. It's it can still be considered a very valuable thing for society.
Well, how so?
When and again, this was highlighted in the documents back in ASIC time, but in the October 17. But when you allow a business that through no fault of the owner has got itself into trouble, giving that business a chance to survive and to continue on in a new form means that landlords will continue to get paid, employees will continue to be employed,
right?
Suppliers will still be able to supply goods to the company, and customers will still be able to receive goods.
Right.
So, and often you're still going to need finance and you're still going to need other things. So it can be a very important part of our small business economy.
So rather than just the business shutting down, the wheels keep turning. People still got jobs, they're still getting paid.
Yep, and they're not necessarily losing the money that they would otherwise lose. Yep.
And they're still paying their tax, so that's a good thing.
Good
Premises are still occupied. Landlords can still pay their bills. So there are actually some benefits from it. So and this is not us making this up. This is not Ashley and Phil just saying this. This is ASIC and the ATO. Actually came out in writing and said that it's beneficial to society. Isn't it funny how you never hear that when you hear people talking about Phoenix?
Yeah, and look, I understand why. I mean, at the end of the day, when we're talking about these type of things, the general market generally only cares about bad news and those bad people who have done bad things. You look at the news and you might get a puppy that's been saved out of a tree or something in the news, and that's the 30-second good news story. But good news doesn't sell, mate. So that's where all this stuff is talked about.
More people tune in to watch a building burn down than a puppy gets saved, don't they?
Well, and the other thing too is that if you do a good restructure, most of the stakeholders are looked after and protected, so everyone moves on. So it's only when it's done bad where people are doing it to burn, where it gets to become public knowledge.
So that's commercial necessity Phoenix. Let's talk a little bit about problematic and then illegal Phoenix. What can you tell us about that, Ashley?
So the problematic is, I guess, the grey area that in the paper that they wanted to make sure was there between the really bad and the really good. There's stuff that happens in the middle. And what they define problematic as is someone or a business or a director who is involved in 2 or 3 of these type of restructures over a relatively short period of time. That means that they're going to be on a radar. They're going to be watched because they may be the type of businessman that shouldn't be in business anymore, or they may be getting a taste for using it for the wrong reasons. So it's still technically legal, but you're going to be on a watch list pretty quickly if you start doing it a little bit more regularly.
Yeah.
Illegal, on the other way, is what we're talking about. That's the stuff that I find abhorrent, everyone finds abhorrent in society, because what they're doing is that they're using it for commercial gain. They're using the structure for not for what the structure was intended for, but to find a way of defeating creditors and personally profiteering from it. So that's it, and most people can identify that very clearly, but they don't necessarily, and that's the one that everyone talks about when they're sitting in the pub saying how bad these things are.
So that's a lot about intent that when they do an illegal phoenix, it's an intent to defeat the creditors, as opposed to an event outside the owner's control, or even with problematic, it just might be a series of unfortunate events for that person.
Yeah.
Whereas with illegal, it effectively becomes part of their business model.
Absolutely.
They gain an advantage over their competitors by setting out not to pay creditors. That'd be a fair call?
Absolutely. Right. It's very much about intent.
So basically, in a phoenix, a new entity starts trading the business, and the old company goes into liquidation. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So there's a lot of difference between legal and illegal phoenix, or commercial necessity and illegal phoenix, and that comes down, as we've said, to the frequency of those events and the intent of the director. Yep. What other elements do you think are critical when you look at the whole phoenix world, Ashley?
Well, probably the most critical is when we do this transfer of assets, which is all part of this phoenix where the new entity rises out, is how that new entity got its assets. So if the assets have been bought for market value, if you bought the assets for market value, then and the new entity pays for that and gives that money to the old entity, then that brings it back into the commercial necessity world. If they're moved out for no consideration, then that brings it into the illegal side, and that's on that intent side. So if fair market value is not paid, and the creditors therefore become disadvantaged because those assets, if left to the liquidator, would potentially provide a higher return to them than if they didn't, then that's where the problem comes in.
Right.
So as long as market value is paid and it's actually paid, then that's one of the big critical things.
Yeah. Now, we just had a question come up about a link to the ASIC and ATO article that we spoke about.
Yep.
It was actually a speech that was given at a conference. I believe it was a gentleman, Mr. Brown. I can't remember his first name, but he actually got a post on it on LinkedIn where he describes what Ashley and I have just been talking about.
So John, if you can't find it, certainly give us an email and we'll send you in the direction.
All right, so that was 2017. And since that time, there's actually been legislation introduced to address the whole Phoenix issue. Now, that was the Treasury Laws Amendment Combating Illegal Phoenix Act of 2020. And thank goodness they actually put something in writing.
Hallelujah. Finally. Put some robustness around it so that we stopped having these people going, oh, this is wrong. Well, now there's legislation that says if it's wrong, prove it in there. Yeah. Very exciting days.
I remember when I first joined the firm, Ashley, we were all too scared to even say the word Phoenix because of the negative perception about it.
Yep.
But now it's covered in the legislation and it's all documented. So, Ash, what can you tell us about some of the major elements of that legislation?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's the first time the government has actually used the words Phoenix in terms of the legislation, and it was brought in, as I say, to try and defeat against this illegal stuff. Now, like any legislation, whenever these new things are written, they have to create new terms that no one in the industry has ever heard of before. Yep. And they created a new one called creditor defeating dispositions. And really, the idea of the creditor defeating disposition is that it means any sale or transfer of assets that is intended to defeat creditors. So if there is a movement of assets and it's to defeat creditors, then that's where this starts to come in.
Right.
So they define it as a disposition that is for less than market value or the best price reasonably obtainable. So if the assets are moved for less than market value or for the reasonable price, then you've got a creditor defeating disposition and it becomes a real issue.
Right.
If it's done mark value, we don't have that problem. So now the other benefit of this legislation was that it gave liquidators some more power against ASIC and the regulators, gave them some more power against directors who are involved in this type of thing, and more importantly, to promoters of these type of transactions where they were done wrong. So we were very excited about that, because even though we are a firm that helps support directors do it, we know that it will get rid of some of the riffraff in there, or at least get someone the ability to go after them. So they created some civil and criminal penalties around this type of thing. And the other big part of it was that it gave liquidators some extra power. So now most people would say that's a really bad thing, and I know there's some liquidators on here and they're nice guys, but the extra power was that if people were moving these assets illegally, it was very difficult for them to get to them. They'd often have to go through court cases, use weird parts of the Act. Under this legislation, if it is moved inappropriately, then they can actually get their hands on it a whole lot easier than they did in the past. Okay. So it was very useful legislation to bring in.
Yeah, so very interesting, Ashley. So creditor defeating dispositions, market value, or the best price reasonably obtainable? What's that second bit mean?
You're not going to ask me that, are you?
Yeah, I am, absolutely.
They put me they're truly in the hot seat. So you're going to ask me what something that is So
best price reasonably obtainable. What does that mean?
So the concept behind including it, when you look at the explanatory notes, was that when we're dealing with people who are in distress, and which is really what this legislation is trying to deal with, to comfortably look after those who are legally doing it compared to smacking those that aren't, is that reasonable price. These directors are going to be under some duress because they're in some financial distress. A lot of duresses there. But so the reasonable price meant that if you're under pressure and you needed to sell something to keep your business alive, so you may sell it for 5 or 10 or 15% cheaper to get a quick sale,
right?
Then that gave some scope and some latitude for that to occur because you're under distress. But what it was trying to do, yes, it is subjective, but it's trying to avoid that the original concept of a willing buyer and a willing seller. Well, a willing seller isn't necessarily there if they're under distress. They're an anxious seller.
Yeah.
So that can change the price slightly. So they wanted to try and allow for that in the legislation.
All right. So they're under a bit of pressure. They need money in a hurry. An asset might be worth 60 grand, but if someone offers them 55, they're going to grab it. But you use the word subjective, and it is a little bit subjective about what's the best price reasonably obtainable.
It's not a little bit subjective. It's a lot subjective.
So when we look at that, what sort of things need to be considered when you look at what is the best price reasonably obtainable with an anxious seller under that sort of pressure?
Well, I think until it actually goes through the courts, it's going to be hard to say that with any definitive, Phil. But our perspective as the Jonge Read is that when we're working with directors who are going through one of these transactions, is just do it at market value. So do it at its full value. So, they're selling the assets and the goodwill at their full value, at values determined by independent valuers.
Right.
They've got good PI, so we can leave it with them to sort themselves out. And I know that we've got one online now, so they know what they're doing, they know how to do it, so they can make those decisions themselves and get that value. So that's the easiest way to avoid the show subjectivity to it.
And that's the way we do it, Ash. That's the Jonge Read, everything's done at market value.
Yeah, that's how we support our directors to do it, absolutely. Yeah. The other thing is, if you're doing it and putting it on auction and waiting for a normal auction sale and process, that's a clear point that's what the market was willing to pay on that day. Where say, for instance, someone tries to sell it to their friend in the same industry and they sell it for 20%, that's probably not going to cover it off.
Not reasonable.
Not reasonable. There's some circumstances there that would probably indicate that might be creditor defeating. If you're selling it to a related party for under that market value, that's going to be suspicious. And that's going to be looked at as potentially trying to use this subjectivity the wrong way.
So they really look at what steps you've taken to determine whether it's reasonable or not.
That's correct.
All right. So Ash, let's say that a client does get a valuation. So they get a valuation of, and we'll just stick to physical assets, right? So they get a valuation of plant and equipment. Now, I've seen these things, and every time you get a valuation, it's got the market value on there, and it's got the liquidation or for sale value on there. So is using like a midpoint between the two, is that okay? Like it's still better than someone's going to get in liquidation.
Seriously?
So surely that's all right.
You're going to bring this fight up again.
Yeah. Discussion, Ashley. We don't fight, mate.
Discussion. We don't fight. Look, this is a bit subjective, but the reality is that you go into a subjective area using a midpoint. So our focus is always around using full market value for the sale of an asset. There can't be any question then that you're getting the best price possible. If you use a midpoint and it's a business that's in a going concern state, you bring in that subjectivity that you've undersold it. So, I think there would be a lot of liquidators who would be very happy to get a midpoint sale rather than the auction value.
Yep.
But when you're in a transaction of this nature, then you've got two semi-related or related parties. You put yourself at great risk if you try and use a midpoint. So you need to use market value at all times.
Yeah, and if you're, as you say, you're doing it to a related party, you're doing it at full market value, that's really consistent and compliant with the legislation.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. Now, I've actually done a bit of research here, Ash. And,
sure you have.
I've got a recent example of a real-life Jonge Read file that I believe you and I had a robust discussion about at the time.
I don't believe, we know. Yes.
Now, for this client, the market value of the equipment was $2.95 million. The auction value was $2,094,000.
Yep.
Now, that's a difference of $856,000. So in this case, the client paid the 2.95?
Absolutely.
Right.
So as I say, for the protection of our directors, the advice is always going to be to pay the full market value for those assets. Now, there's our robust chat around this one had a lot. There were a lot of other factors than just purely the high and low numbers.
Yeah.
But yeah, our client had to pay the the new entity needed to buy it at $2.9 million.
And I think everybody, even in our discussion, we both acknowledged that if that company went into liquidation and a liquidator tried to sell that, there was no way he was getting 2.95 for it.
No.
That'd be a fair call.
No, and even the director believed that they'd probably overvalued. So that even the director believed that they were overvalued, but that was the documented value that we had to go with.
I see that in the chat, Ian agrees with you. So
yes,
he's on your side. Thanks,
Ian. Valuers, they know the game.
Yeah. So, Ashley, we've differentiated between legal and illegal. We've spoken about selling things for market value. Could you just run us through at a high level how to do a legal Phoenix? How do you do a restructure as a commercial necessity?
Sure. Yeah. So, at the high level, it's actually relatively simple. You get a plant and equipment valuation, you get a goodwill valuation. You add those two numbers together, and that goes into a sale agreement. You enter an agreement with the new entity to buy the goods, to buy the business under a going concern basis, and then the new entity needs to pay for that. Now, whether they pay for that under vendor finance terms or whether they pay for that cash will come down to the situation of the directors and what money is available. When you're putting that sale together, you need to look at what the security positions are in place. So if there is already bank loans or GSAs in place, the old fixed and floating charges for those with hair like mine. No, you can't call yours grey, mate. I don't know what that is. But, you've got to deal with the secured creditors to get permission to actually be able to sell the goods and all that sort of stuff. So in a nutshell, it's about getting the proper market value valuations entering into a sale agreement, documenting it correctly, and then the new entity paying for it. Once that money's back in the old entity's hands, then and we're dealing with a Phoenix where it's liquidated, then the liquidator addresses what they need to with that cash.
Well, that sounds pretty straightforward, but there's lots of issues in that little bit of detail you gave us there. Tell me a little bit more. What sort of details do we need to be conscious of or consider when we're doing a legal Phoenix?
Yeah, well, I think when we look at there's a lot to do around finance. I talked about whether there's vendor finance or bringing finance into the new entity. I mean, most of our referrers would have seen many a business that's been undercapitalised when it started. So when you're doing a restructure, we want to make sure that the new entity's got appropriate working capital and finance in place to do that. How will the new business trade? Will they have the credit? Will they have the suppliers that they need? Will they have any of the various bits and pieces that they need in terms of being able to stay on site? If they've got leased premises, got to deal with the employees, who's going to come across to the new entity, how are you going to bring them across, what's involved in that, and just working capital requirements, debtor finance, other type of finance available, even bringing across the trading name. Like a lot of people, even though they might be in distress, the trading name has a lot of value, or to the owner it has a lot of value. So they want to be able to continue to trade under that. So, all that sort of stuff needs to be done. Signage, making sure signs on the building. A lot of people put up, if we don't, but Jonge Read Proprietary Limited. Well, if you're not Jonge Read Proprietary Limited anymore, then you legally need to change those signs. So all those things become part of the necessary transition of a business.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned that the purchasing entity has the potential to pay off that purchase price over a period of time. So they can get vendor finance to buy the business?
Yeah, so even in these restructure or business necessity Phoenixes, you can still structure a transaction to have vendor finance in place. And that vendor finance still has to be documented. It's got to be reasonable, and it's got to be done at a reasonable price and a reasonable time period. There's got to be appropriate security in place, because if the vendor finance fell over, the old company should be able to get control of its assets again that it may have already handed over. So all that, if it's documented correctly, absolutely it can still be done. And the liquidator might get access to that vendor finance terms over the next 18 months or 2 years, depending on how it's structured.
So we need to make sure that those vendor finance terms are commercial. So I couldn't pay it off over a 50-year term, for example.
Oh, no, probably not. No.
And once the liquidator's appointed to the old company, if there's any further payments due, they become payable to the liquidator.
Well, they become payable to the old company, which is the old company by the liquidator.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that, the new business needs to consider its cash flow, and there's no point trying to do it if you don't have a viable and sustainable cash flow.
Yep.
So the new business can get finance?
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, even before COVID, there were plenty of funders out there do it. Now we're actually finding that there's even more people available for these type of transactions. Right. The traditional ones in this type of thing, the debtor finance, some trade finance facilities. Trade's a bit harder, but you can still get it.
Yep.
But they're fairly simple ones to do. But you can get lump sum working capital funds from the second tier lenders at the moment to get businesses started. You can even get funding to buy the business out, because one of the things for a funder is that they've actually got a cleaner entity with less skeletons in the closet.
That's it.
As long as they know that it's the transaction is legitimate and clean, which a lot of financiers now are getting to understand, that a legal business, and we've had cases where the financier has asked us to complete the business restructure because they're willing to lend to the business, but not to the shell that has the legacy issues in it. So you've got a real change of mindset now where these opportunities exist. So there's certainly plenty of opportunities for finance now.
And I'd say that at Jonge Read, we know a lot of financiers that are familiar with this and comfortable with it, and that we've got as part of our network.
That's correct.
Yeah, right. Okay, so you also mentioned that employees can be taken over in the new business. Could you just tell us a little bit more of the ins and outs on all of that?
Well, it's quite simple. If the new business wants to employ those new employees, they can bring them across. The business, however, must bring over the employee entitlements that are outstanding. So holiday pay, all that sort of stuff needs to come over, and there'll be a continuation of their service. If you the only people who, so you can bring all employees across and all their entitlements. For unrelated employees, so not the director, their wife, their kids, uncles and aunts and what have you, all of the rest of them, the liability that's brought over can be used as an offset against the purchase price.
Right.
So, so you can bring all of that over, and if your business is worth 50,000, then and there's 20,000 worth of employee entitlements, then you only need to pay $30,000 net for the business.
Okay, so
I should say, Phil, that doesn't include super.
No, not super.
So super does not come over in that. Super needs to be paid in the old entity.
Right. So from just going through some of the points that you've mentioned, I think that a lot of people, that when they look at how do they restructure a business and how do they pay fair market value for everything, that it might all sound too hard. But from what you've said today, when you consider that you may be able to arrange commercial vendor finance, so the purchasing entity can pay it off over a period of time. There may be financing options, either through debtor finance or another form of finance to help pay the purchase price. And you can offset unrelated employee entitlements, excluding superannuation against the purchase price. It's starting to sound a little bit more doable.
Look, I think, Phil, the interesting thing in talking to a lot of our referrers is that people understand that it logically makes sense, but there's two things that I guess hold them up. One is what you've talked about, that they think it's too complicated and too hard, and that's where you do need to have the right firm to guide people through it, because it is a specialist area. And as a firm, that's all we specialise only in helping directors through this. We're not accountant. We don't do all that other stuff. We just do. I think we've talked about it before. I call ourselves the intensive care department. We just patch it up and then hand it back. But the other part is that people have a real fear that encouraging this transaction is illegal, and it's not. It's very clearly in the legislation that for the right reasons, done the right way, it is completely legal and almost a recommended for certain circumstances as an option for people. And that's what the corporate form is there for.
Now, I think you made the point earlier in our discussions about this, that even though it's legal and you can do it, doesn't necessarily mean you should all the time.
No. And certainly when you look at some people, you go, look, you really should just shut your business down and go and get a job. And that sometimes is actually still the better option.
So really, there's no point restructuring a business if it's fundamentally not viable. If it doesn't have a really good chance of success, you really shouldn't do it. Would that be your view?
Oh, absolutely. Like, when people come to us, it's like, if people have the ability and think that they can turn it around, absolutely you can do that. But if it's not viable, no, don't do this just for fun.
But even if you want to pack up and go home and go get a job, you can still benefit from getting some advice about the process and how to go about it, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. A controlled shutdown needs to be done very carefully. But look, Phil, we're running out of time, and that's a whole different conversation. We have had a question pop up before we just move on to the final bit we're going to talk about, Phil. Just touching on dealing with secured creditors in the old entity. So that's a very complex answer. Or question, a simple question, but a very complex answer. But the reality is secured creditors have a right to the assets of the business as a whole, and therefore any movement of those assets out of that entity needs to be done at the request of that secured creditor in the agreement. So sometimes you can, a secured creditor will be willing to support having a new facility open up in the old entity, which would then pay out the facility in the old and allow that transaction to come through. Other times you just need to have that secured lender paid out depending on the circumstances. But it is about communicating with them and talking to them and making sure that they're comfortable with whatever they're doing. So I hope that helps, Monica. It's a little bit open-ended in terms of that there could be 100 different things. So, but all right, Phil, I'll back to you. Right. You had something else you were going to ask me.
Yeah, we'll just bring it to a close, Ash. But before we finish off today, you've explained that commercial necessity Phoenix is completely legal, but not necessarily something you should do all the time. What happens when instead of doing a commercial necessity Phoenix, the company just goes straight into liquidation? What sort of outcome would you expect there, or what are the differences?
So one of the big differences is that your ability to continue to trade the business is very limited. So whether you do that through a voluntary administration or a liquidation, the administrator or liquidator becomes responsible for the affairs at that point. And unless you happen to be a virgin, where there's bucket loads of money sitting in the bank, trading on a business is a very dangerous thing for most liquidators or administrators. So generally what you find is the business gets shut down fairly quickly. Once it gets shut down, there's some other things that have to happen pretty quickly. And that is you need to get assets out of the security of maybe the landlord, or you'll have people who have got security over those assets will take them back pretty quickly, repossess them. Yep. They get taken off to auctioneers' houses, and all of that sort of comes with great significant cost. So if there isn't huge amounts of assets, and predominantly when we're talking about small and micro businesses, we're not talking about billions of dollars of assets sitting in the pool, that gets eroded very quickly. And then by the time all of that's cleaned up and dealt with, and there's often not a lot left over for the creditors. So quite often we find by structuring things better, there can be more access, more funds available to all the stakeholders. So, I mean, that's a big part of what's happening. So the going concern, the other thing I was going to say with the going concern is that when they get shut down, what value there could be in the going concern component of the business erodes pretty much instantly.
Yeah,
client lists become not worth very little. The business name, the business name becomes less valuable by the minute. So a lot of these things sort of just die off very quickly there.
So the creditors aren't going to benefit from the value of the goodwill.
No.
Assets are going to get sold at liquidation value or at auction value. Probably a lot of assets are just going to get abandoned because they're not worth going and collecting and putting in an auction house, whereas they do have some worth to someone that's going to operate that business in the future. And of course, liquidators are entitled to recover their fees, and that's reasonable. I've got no problem with that. But and it costs them money to do their job and to do the things that you've spoken about. And again, that money will be paid in their professional fees before there's a distribution to the creditors.
Yep.
Right. Well, that's all I had for you today, Ashley.
Yeah. Phil, I've just had another question pop in, which people may not see because it's just come in as a direct message. But the question was, what do you say about tax losses thrown away in the old entity? Does this get factored into what to do, i.e. compromise the debts in the old entity? So good question, Ray.
Yeah, good question.
Yes, it does. So, I mean, depending on, again, every scenario is different. So if you have a business that has significant tax losses and you're looking at what options there are, whether it be a restructure, whether it be a VA and DOCA, which then allows tax losses to be held in place, then all of that does need to be calculated what comes up with the best result for the client. In some cases, holding on to a tax loss when you've got some fairly insurmountable debts that probably you're not going to jump over, then you've got to make that compromised decision about whether you keep those or whether you have a fresh start. But it certainly does play into any decision about how you look after what a client should or shouldn't do in the circumstances.
And I think that's a great question. I'll just add to that, Ashley, that when we talk about compromising debts, there are some creditors that you just cannot compromise debts with. When you look at some statutory type debts, they have policies and they don't want to set precedents. So again, you need to take not only the debts, but the composition of those debts into account when you assess the right strategy for that particular client.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll open it up now, just as we start to wrap up, if there are any other questions. If people aren't keyboard warriors like I'm not, you can put up your hand using the system somehow. And you put your hand up and Elise, our administrator, will tell me that that's what I need to do. Elise is also going to put up a poll right in the middle of our faces that hopefully you'll say nice things about us, but that's okay. But if we've got any other questions or comments that people would like to raise, now's the time to do it. While that's happening, I guess I'll just start to wrap up by saying that one of the questions that we had this morning, actually, Phil, we talked about personal guarantees, and we haven't covered that off. So some people asked someone asked the question. Someone asked the question the other day, this morning, what happens to creditors that have got personal guarantees? And when you're looking at a restructure, that's dealing with the corporate side of things. But if there are personal guarantees, and Phil and I have joked many a time in the past about how useless this corporate veil is these days, between DPNs and guarantees by creditors. If that exists, then there is still a component that needs to be addressed at a personal level. So it's really important that, and part of what our focus is as a firm, is that we don't just deal with the corporate. It's really, really important that you don't just go, okay, there's this bit without worrying about the West. You've got to look at the whole story, both corporately and personally. And putting those two pieces of the puzzle together is critical to making sure that you have the right outcome. And that's one thing that we will always do in our strategy reports. Do you have anything else you wanted to add to that, Phil?
I'll just say one thing, and those people in the audience that have dealt with us before would already know this, but unlike a lot of people that operate in our field, we actually do provide comprehensive written advice. We're happy to share that with the accountant or lawyer or professional person that's referred that client to us and give them an opportunity to review it as well. And that's all done with no charge and no obligation. And, issues like where do you sit with personal guarantees will be discussed in that report so that everybody knows where they stand.
Yep. And I guess I'll there doesn't appear to be any more questions, so I'll wrap it up now. And I'd just like to say, for anyone who does have clients that have issues, even if they're not under pressure at the moment, but there's certainly not a lot of pressure on businesses, now's the time to have a look at it. But one thing that we're that as a firm, we're very committed to is that we have this gentleman on the screen with me, Phil, who is our National Compliance Manager. And as a firm, we make sure that every strategy that leaves our firm and goes to a client meets all legal requirements, so that we know that our directors and our clients and our referrers are protected because we have that full compliance hat on. And sometimes I've got to tell you, even though that's his role and we employed him to do that role, amongst other things, it can be a real pain in the ass, but he is tight to the rules, and it's a really valuable thing to have, and it should hopefully gives everyone else the confidence that it gives Hank and I as the business owners, the comfort that we're providing the best possible advice, but also the most compliant advice. So on that note, if there's nothing else that anyone's got any last questions, we'll finish up. Thank you all very much for coming along again this month. We certainly have enjoyed the ride of doing these through the course of this year. Normally I promote what next month is, but I'm not sure that we actually know yet, do we, Phil?
Well, it's a little bit about maybe that personal guarantee stuff that we spoke about. and how to deal with the outcome of that, or what the ramifications of doing a commercial necessity restructure are for the individual. Now, we're going to cover off on that in our referrer email that'll be going out later this week. So if you're not on our mailing list, drop us a line and we'll put you on there, and you'll get a bit of a heads up about what we're going to talk about next month.
No problem. And there was a question there, will the recording be made available? Yes, it will. We run 2 of these today, so apparently someone more important and better than me picks which one was the better version of our show. And that will be put up hopefully within a couple of days. And you'll also get a link to it in an email as well, I believe.
Now, in the earlier one today, I'm actually orange. So I look like I've been to Donald Trump's spray tan booth.
You're an Oompa Loompa. You were the Oompa Loompa this morning.
And in this afternoon's one, I'm sort of grey. So we'll see which one ends up on YouTube.
Mortician grey.
Mortician grey, that's it.
All right. Thanks,
everybody.
I really appreciate your attendance, and we'll talk again soon.
Cheers.
Thank you.